everyone, thank you for watching this video. So today we're just going to make a really simple little girl's dress. We are doing view A, but we're getting rid of the sleeve and we're also not using the pockets on either of the dresses. We're keeping it really simple and it's going to have a zip and it's going to have trimming on the bottom. To make this dress, we just use quilting fabric. So the pattern and the fabric is available as a kit or you could buy it separately. So I'll just leave a link down below and you can go follow that if you would like to make this dress yourself. The pattern ranges from 18 months to 6 years old. I'll also make sure to include a large variety of quilting fabrics you can choose from to make the dress out of. And I hope you enjoy this video. So now we're ironing all our pattern pieces. On straight edges you can fold under the excess paper to the size you want, but on curved pieces such as the bodice, the pattern has to be traced to the preferred size. Make sure to be accurate when you're tracing and add the size, all grain lines, notches and pattern details, including the pattern number to your traced pattern piece. So now we're just ironing our fabrics. It's very important to do this as you'll achieve a more accurate cut. For cutting with this fabric, we're actually more concerned about the lines sitting directly on top of each other rather than keeping the selvage parallel to the fold. So we do have a bit of crookedness happening here, but we don't think it will be much of an issue. The front bodice piece will then be cut on the fold, while the back bodice pieces will be cut with a seam down the center back. We also made sure the tops of the side seams sit along the same line so the lines of the fabric match up. For the lining we used a cotton voile and we're making sure the distance between the selvage and the fold is the same on both sides. These are cut the same way we cut the main fabric. It's important to have a good pair of sharp dressmaking scissors as that gets the job done as easy and as perfect as possible. Now the next step is to take one of the back pieces, lay it right sides together and pin at the shoulder seam. And also check to make sure you have the center back of these pieces facing towards each other, just like we have here. Start with a reverse using your 5/8 of an inch or 1.5 seam allowance and sew neatly across both shoulder seams. Instead of cutting off your thread at the end, Bernadette just runs a small chain of stitches and then joins onto the next shoulder seam. This just saves a bit of fiddle time. Stitch the lining pieces together the exact same way. Press open those seams on both the lining pieces and the main fabric pieces. Pressing open the seams reduces bulk at the shoulder, and it is also very important to press everything as you go. Now we can lie these pieces right sides together to stitch the neckline. First we will pin the shoulder seams and make sure the pin goes through the center on both sides like Bernadette is doing here. This way your shoulder seams will line up perfectly. She also marked her 1.5 seam allowance around the whole neckline. It can get a bit tricky to stitch this part accurately by just relying on the guide on your machine because of all the curves involved in this neckline. So taking the time to mark out a line to follow is totally worth it for the end result. Bernadette is very accurate, as you can see now as she is folding the front piece in half by pinning through the layers along the marking she made at the curve. Now she is marking on the other side where her pins show through, so her blue line is now definitely symmetrical. She carefully stitches around the neckline while sewing directly on top of the blue marking. Bernadette really does take her time in going around the curves and constantly readjusts her fabric, and you'll find that this is what will give you an accurate line of stitching. Now we have to trim the seam allowance to roughly around 1 centimeter. Trimming the seam allowance reduces a lot of bulk. And then we have to clip all the curves. If you don't clip your curves, your fabric won't lay flat. You can check if you've clipped them enough by pulling your fabric straight. Next we have to understitch the whole neckline. This is done by folding a seam allowance towards the lining side and stitching 2 millimeters from your seam onto the lining side and through the seam allowance. We use Faf's stitch in the ditch foot for an accurate line, however it is possible to use your normal sewing foot as well. Once you've done that, you can give your neckline a really good iron and you'll find that it sits absolutely perfectly. Now Bernadette is just double checking the symmetry in the neckline, and it is a little bit off, but you won't be able to tell when the little girl was wearing it anyway, so we left it. Now we have to stitch the armhole seam, so we've just flipped the bodice pieces so they're right sides together again and lined up the armhole seams. This time Bernadette will pin the shoulder seam of the main bodice piece just 1/2 centimeter shy from the raw edge of the lining bodice piece. This is to allow for that small amount of fabric loss when understitching. Basically, when it's all stitched, it will lay flat, trust us. Also, notice how Bernadette inserts her pins. She does it with the way it will be sewn in mind. So when it goes through the machine, the ball of the pin will be pointing away from the machine and it is easier to remove. Do this for both armhole sides. Now we have to trim and clip the seam allowance just like we did around the neckline. Now we're going to understitch the armhole as well, starting from the bottom and working our way up to the shoulder seam. You'll find it will become difficult to sew all the way around in one go, so stitch as far as possible on one side and do the same thing starting from the other side. Once you've understitched, you can turn the whole bodice right side out and give it a really good press. To stitch up the side seams, we have to fold the bodice in half, line it up, and then open out the seams so they line up together right sides. Put your pin through the underarm seam and then you can pin through the other layers of fabric afterwards. And then just stitch 1.5 centimeters through that seam. Now Bernadette's just folding it in half again, and then she's lining up the bottom of that seam and pinning it. So now it will sit like a bodice. Now we're going to sew the skirt part together. Over here, Bernadette is just pointing out that it needs to be cut on the fold. So we folded our fabric right sides together to the correct width of the pattern. We don't want to waste too much fabric. Then we check the selvage is the same distance from the fold and the skirt center front will lie on the fold. We decided to make the skirt about 2 inches longer than the original pattern, so when the little girl grows older, she can still wear her favourite dress and there will be a hem to let down. Now we're going to cut out the back of the skirt with another length of fabric, but this time it won't be cut on the fold as we are putting a zip down the centre back. The pattern has a notch marking on where the zip will end, however it is actually marked the wrong way around on the pattern, so just make sure to flip the markings around and you will be fine. We're also extending this hem by 2 inches to match the skirt front length. Bernadette just does a tiny notch to mark where the zip will end. Pin the centre back seam together up to the notch where the zip will end. Then lay the skirt front piece on top, right sides together and pin down the side seams. Just stitch your 1.5 centimeter seam allowance down both sides and up through the centre back, but make sure to stop at the notch. With ours, we forgot to stop, so we had to unpick the opening at the top of the centre back and restitch the seam. This time, stopping at the notch and doing a really good reverse, as this is a weak point and hard to fix when everything is sewn together. Finish off the side seams and only the side seams. We will do the centre back later on. Then press your seams towards the back of the skirt. Before we gather the top of the skirt, we're going to quickly mark where the center front is. Trust me, you're going to need this mark once the skirt is gathered. Now we've just marked 1.5 centimeters from both raw edges because we don't want to start gathering into the zip seam as it causes unnecessary bulk. Have your stitch length on about 3.5. The longer your stitch length, the more uneven your gathers will turn out. The first row of stitching will be on your stitching line, so the 1.5 centimeter seam allowance. Make sure to leave long threads at the start and end to make it easier to gather. The next row of stitching will be about 1/4 inch from the previous row of stitching you just did. Start 1.5 centimeters in again, leave a long tail, no reverse, and you're good to go. Hold the 2 bobbin threads with one hand and use the other one to push the gathers towards the center front. And no, it is not a myth. The bobbin threads are actually easier to gather with. Once you have gathered one side enough, start from the other side using the bobbin thread still. If you gather one side with top thread and the other with bobbin thread, the stitches will lock in the middle and you'll have a lot of trouble gathering. Bernadette's just pinning the lining and main bodice pieces together near the bottom, and you'll find the lining will poke through just a little bit more because of the understitching. This is where the center marking will come in handy. Find it and match it up with the bodice center front, right sides together. Then you can match up the side seams with each other. It is easier to have the skirt gathered more than necessary so you can ungather it to the preferred length. Once the side seams and center front are pinned in place, you can use your pin to even out the gathers. Then you can pin through all the layers along the 1.5 centimeter stitching line. Do the same for the back. Match up both center backs while maneuvering the gathers to fit. You also have to tie off the gathering threads at the end, so Bernadette just pulls them through to one side and ties all 4 loose threads into a knot. Put your stitch length down to 2.5 and stitch through all the layers, making sure to start from the very start, not 1.5 centimeters in like we did with the gathering stitch, and stitch your 1.5 centimeter seam allowance. So overlock that seam with the gathers, and you can also finish off the raw edge down the 2 center back seam edges. Over here you can see some of the gathering stitch is showing from the right side. Because we have stitched the seam, we can take out that gathering stitch and it won't show from the right side anymore. We are now putting in the invisible zipper, so please don't be scared of it. We will show you how it's done easily and properly. First we place the zipper so it's face down and the zipper teeth are facing away from the raw edge. Align the plastic stopper so it's about 2 millimeters shy from the top of the center back. Then do a row of stay stitching. This will hold the zipper in place, which will make it easier to sew properly in later. When you reach the start of the stitch up seam, just sew about 1/4 inch past it and then just cut the thread. This is an invisible zipper foot. It has 2 channels underneath for the zipper teeth to sit through. Just stitch all the way down until you're about 1/4 inch past the start of the seam and then reverse. This type of zipper foot does a great job in moving the zipper teeth out of the way so the line of stitching can be really close, and then it will end up like a virtually invisible seam. Now Bernadette is just zipping it up just to check that it's all sewn in correctly. Then you have to lay the zip and the dress down flat on a table and mark where the seam starts on the side you haven't stitched yet. Make sure to transfer this marking onto the zip and the fabric. Then she also marks on the zip where the waistline sits so we can achieve a perfectly straight line across the waist. Once you have marked everything, unzip all the way down and pin those marks in place first. And pin the top so the plastic stopper sits the same distance down from the top as the other side. Stay stitch first to hold it in place and then stitch again with the zipper teeth running through the channel of the zipper foot, just like we did on the other side. Again, you want to finish a 1/4 inch past the start of the seam allowance and zip up the zip to check if there's no pleats at the bottom and the waistline matches up. To finish off the top of the zip, we fold the top into the seam allowance and then hand sew it in place to secure. We hand sew instead of machine sew this part, so we will see no stitching lines from the right side. So here, Bernadette is trying to show me how to make a knot with one hand, and I was like, do it again, I didn't catch it. So she did it again, and I still didn't get how she did it. So if you can work it out, then good on you, because I can't work it out. Notice how she's only catching the lining when she's hand sewing. Then she knots it twice and pulls the thread down through the zipper, then cuts it. This ensures that the loose thread at the end stays inside the seam. Now the zip is sewn in, we can cut off the end about 1 inch from where the seam starts, and we decided to finish off this part designer style, so we found some ribbon which was the same width and stitched it on the end of the zip, right sides together with about a 1 cm seam allowance. Then she folded the ribbon to the other side and stitched it in place with the top stitch on the right side. The excess can be cut off just like that, and then she stitches the ribbon and zip to the seam allowance, but don't make the mistake of stitching through both layers of the skirt. You're just stitching it to the open seam allowance. You don't want to see the stitching from the right side. As you can tell now, everything matches up and sits perfectly, and that is the result you'll get from taking the time to mark and stitch everything carefully. Now we've just pinned up the hem about 10 centimeters, and then we can turn it to the right side and estimate where we will stitch the trimming on. Once we marked a line, we just unpinned the hem, so we're only stitching the trimming through one layer. We started from the center back, and we're just doing a really nice neat line of top stitching down both edges of the satin ribbon, and we're using that previous chalk line that we made to sort of keep it in line. So now we're cutting off the ribbon about 1 centimeter past where we started, and then we just fold it under and stitch over the top to finish off. Now we can do the exact same thing on the other side. Now we're stitching on the orange rickrack. Check if it's placed the same distance from the ribbon every now and then, just to keep it consistent, and then you can finish it off the same way we finished off the ribbon. Just fold it under and stitch over the top. Then we finished off the hem from the right side, so that when you turn the hem to the wrong side, you will see the right side of the overlocking, and we also made sure to keep our side seam towards the back. So now we're just measuring 10 centimeters again and pinning the hem in place this time. So now we're just estimating where the pink ribbon will go on top, so we don't stitch it through both layers. A really professional way to finish off these types of hems is to stitch directly through the overlocking, like directly down the middle, and then that way it doesn't flap too much and it catches enough of the fabric to stay in place for a very long time. So we just stitched the pink rickrack on, making sure to not stitch it over the hem so we can easily let it down later. Give everything a really good iron. This will make it look profesh. And now you are done. That concludes this video. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you learned a lot, and I also hope, if you don't sew, it inspires you to sew. But like I said before, you are able to go get the pattern and the fabric down below on Etsy. I've got a little listing up if you would like to purchase that. And this is my first ever YouTube video tutorial, and I hope it's the first of many. So I hope to see you all next time, and until then, happy sewing.